care of yourselves, taking breaks, and getting food and drinks as needed. Dan, do you want to begin the recording?
Just did.
Excellent. All right. So we are here to talk about building a culture of informed consent, sex positive sex ed. I don't know about y'all, but the idea of sex positive sex ed seems really exciting to me, and also is definitely not what I got in any of my school sex ed. So I'm super excited to have with us some panelists who are going to help us understand even what sex positive sex ed could look like, what a culture of consent might look like, and help us imagine what different sex ed, how different sex ed could be if it actually reflected our values and the needs of our communities. We could spend lots of time on their robust resumes and accomplishments, but I actually just want to briefly introduce each of our speakers and then give them each a minute to tell you a little bit about themselves directly and introduce themselves to you on their own behalfs. So our three speakers today will be Brittany McBride, who uses she, her pronouns and is with Advocates for Youth. Jennifer Driver, who uses she and her pronouns and is with SIECUS, and Tanya Turner, who uses she and her pronouns and is with Sexy Sex Ed. Brittany, why don't you start us off? Tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Hey, so excited to be with you today. My name's Brittany. I am the Associate Director of Sex Education at Advocates for Youth. I have been doing sex education for the last 11 years, and the last 4 of them being at Advocates. So really my work is centered around providing TA and professional development to the adults who then teach young people across the country. So I do a lot of individualized coaching, larger training sessions when the world was open again, to school districts around how to provide sex ed in general, or for some cases provide even better sex ed than what they're already offering. So I work with about 50 of the largest school districts across the country, and helping them kind of move along that spectrum towards more complete sex ed. So super excited to talk with you all today and kind of give the perspective of what this can look like in school settings.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Jennifer, will you introduce yourselves to our group?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Jennifer Driver. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Strategic Partnerships with SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. We work on state, local, and federal policy advancing sex education, either at school districts, in the state houses, or at the federal level. I was thinking as Brittany was talking, like how I fell into this. So some people are like really passionate and they're like, yes, sex ed, I want to go into this. That wasn't how I fell into it. I am from Alabama, and we had, I know Monica is too, had horrible sex education and no access to services in the community that I lived in. And so one of the reasons that I got into this was to advocate for services for the Black community that I was living in at the time. And so that's how I fell into sex education and have been here for about 15 years. So here I am.
Thank you so much. And Tanya, will you introduce yourself to our group?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tanya Turner, and my pronouns are she, her. I live in Southeast Kentucky. That's where I'm from, in the mountains. And I came into sex ed work about 8 years ago through my own youth organizing work when I was in my early 20s. Because I was helping create youth spaces and youth camps, and when young people were, registering for our summer camps and stuff and saying what they wanted to share and what they wanted to learn, we were hearing a lot about sex ed because they weren't getting it in their schools. And there's just so many, we could all go around and tell a lot of horror stories about the sex ed we got in our schools, I'm sure. But for a while, I was kind of going at this alone and solo because there aren't a ton of sex ed resources in rural Appalachia. But I've been really lucky to connect with groups like Urge and others to learn from over the years. And over the past year, I was able to kind of grow my like Sexy Sex Ed workshop into a more like worker cooperative model. And I have about 20 educators now. And we're mostly funded by each other and our friends, but we pay about 20 different organizers across 5 Appalachian states to do education work. And now, of course, it's mostly digital, so we're figuring that out, but we do weekly live streams on our Instagram, and we've mailed out like 1,500 condoms to people for free over the past few months since COVID started. So we're just trying to figure out what niche we're filling now. But actually, I don't pay myself. I help coordinate, but I pay other organizers, other educators, and I have a couple other part-time jobs that pay for my sex ed work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tanya. So before we get into the questions that we have for these brilliant speakers, you know, hearing this language of like sex positive sex ed, I'm curious for the folks on the call, if you could show by way of like a thumb if you're on the video, and if not, you could use like your thumbs up on your thing. How many folks got sex positive sex ed in school? So this is like yes, and this is like definitely not, and this is like I'm not sure. 2 thumbs down means that you really feel some type of way about it. Okay, I see a lot of big thumbs down. Okay, all right, so we definitely need this panel to help us understand how things could be different. So, so my first question, and I'll just ask the panelists to jump in where you feel moved. So what exactly are the components of sex ed? What is needed in order to have comprehensive and inclusive sex ed, and what's missing?
I'll jump in first and kind of give that, you know, soundbite that everyone loves to use about medically accurate, age appropriate, all that fun stuff. But we've been really pushing the envelope with that because I think sometimes we can get a little bit complacent in using that soundbite when we talk about sex education, and a lot of people really don't understand what we mean when we say comprehensive sex education. So I've started shifting my language to say complete sex education instead. And when we say that sex education is complete, we are talking to far more than just like the sexual needs of people. And instead we're focusing more on developing essential life skills that are going to, one, provide our young people with the information that they deserve and have a right to in order to navigate the lives that they want to live, but also one that is reflective of the world that we're living in and responsive to what we're dealing with on an everyday basis. So we want to make sure that it's all of those great things of like being age appropriate and medically accurate and developmentally appropriate and all that other great stuff, but we also want to be culturally responsive. We want to make sure we're trauma informed. We want to make sure we are sex positive. We want to talk about consent. We want to talk about healthy relationships, unhealthy ones, how to get in them, how to get out of them. We want to be responsive to the needs of our young people so that life doesn't happen to them, and instead they are able to make informed decisions about how they want their life to lead, and then also have the skills available to them to be able to navigate it. And we want to do that in partnership with the community, with caregivers, with anyone who wants to be involved in this. This is not something that we want to do in our own silo. We are looking for a true global community approach to meeting the needs of our young people, because sex ed does not happen in one room over a course of like 3 weeks for an hour every other day. And instead, this is about helping to support folks at all points of their life, from infancy until they're leaving this earth, and making sure that they have all the information that they need. And so for us, this is about supporting parents, this is supporting caregivers, this is supporting teachers, administrators, and most importantly, our young people. So we've been really looking to them to help us develop a better definition. But for me, I'm going to start saying complete and making sure that, you know, what we're getting folks is actually what they need.
Thank you so much.
The things that I think I would add in to what Brittany said, so I agree that it's across the lifespan. The one thing, I also don't generally say comprehensive sex education just because in theory, sex education should be comprehensive. So I think in a lot of places they are doing components of sex ed, right? So you may be getting HIV information, you may be getting, I don't know, teen pregnancy, whatever, reproductive health information, and those are components of. But unless you're getting the full range that Brittany was really talking about, then I don't actually think that you're getting sex education. So most people aren't actually getting sex ed. You may be getting components. I think that sex education includes LGBTQ young people, and it centers LGBTQ young people. Generally, what we see is they will focus on sexual orientation, but rarely do we focus on gender identity and expression. And so I think it's really important when we're talking about what sex education is that we are really clear that it's both sexual orientation and gender identity. And then the last thing that I kind of will piggyback on to what Brittany was saying, so not to repeat everything she was saying, but I think that there are components that we don't generally think of when we talk about sex education. It is also looking at access, so it's access and education. It is looking at the history of our country and the ways in which that young people show up and navigate their space. So it is looking at racism, right? So centering young people of color, and I say young people only because generally we work in school-based settings. However, I'm 36 and I still consider myself young. So it's really looking at how young people are able to access information, the histories and the reasons for why they make decisions for how they control their bodies. And that in itself is also sex education.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to remind folks to, we have the abundance to go slow and we can take some breaths. Spanish translation is often longer to express than English, and we do want to make sure that our conversation is fully accessible to all the members of our community. Thank you both. So we've been talking about complete sex ed, and I love the shift away from some of this more kind of academic-y language. I'm curious, what does sex positive sex ed look like? Tanya, you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah, I could add a little just onto them to get us in this direction. That was all very beautiful. And you have, you know, 3 Southern speakers, so we tend to get sped up. We speed up, we get excited. Here we are. Yeah, the sex positive piece is something, you know, I think honestly we're learning all the time and trying to get better at. And as Olivia was so smart to say earlier, we're all learners and teachers, right? And so our experiences are getting us there. And when we say sex positive sex ed, I think obviously we can say a lot of things about it, but for me, it's really about why sex ed to begin with, like what to what ends. And of course, sex ed is rooted and meant for a lot of harm reduction, but definitely it's because we want a different world, right? Like we want to live in a different world than the one we're in. We have like caught a glimpse of something that we maybe haven't even seen before in real life that we know we deserve and can manifest. And I think that sex positive sex ed is a big component of that. You know, there are a lot of things to organize around toward a different world. And if we aren't experiencing pleasure and joy and aren't navigating consent and building trust and consent practices through all of that organizing, then we're going to manifest and create something that we may not necessarily want, right? So I think the sex positive piece makes it even more grand almost and really centers joy and pleasure and our like wholeness as humans. And I think maybe the big difference in what a lot of folks who were given thumbs down experienced is a lot of sex ed, the sex ed I experience and that I hear a lot about, and that happens definitely in rural Appalachia, is almost exclusively based in fear and shame. And so I think sex positive sex ed is a total paradigm shift that's not based in fear and shame and based in something totally different. It's based in abundance. Yeah, that was a great chat. Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya. So I know a lot of the folks on this call, and many of whom are giving the thumbs down, are in Ohio, Alabama, Georgia, California, right? All different parts of the country. And I know that, sex ed curriculum looks really different state by state. So I'm wondering if one of our speakers could talk about, what are some of the disparities we see in sex ed across the country?
Sure, I'll jump in, and then anyone else, if I missed something. I think, so there is a disparity with sex education, depending on the state you're in, depending on the city you're in, depending on the school, and even down to the teacher. So you may have a teacher in one classroom in a school who is really comfortable with sex education, and you may have one in another classroom who is completely against it. And so though even in that same school system, the sex education looks really different. And so it varies depending on where you are. It also varies by your zip code, right? So schools that are heavily funded are more able often to have the resources to be able to provide and bring in people to teach sex education, to train their teachers to provide sex education. And so a lot of that has to do with the makeup for how we design our school districts, racism within our communities. So really heavily funded schools, generally more white, highly white populated schools generally get a more comprehensive sex education. And what research has showed is that Black and brown students are more likely to receive, oh, hi, Mom, more likely to receive a abstinence-only program, particularly if you're in the southern states. So Louisiana, Mississippi, I heard Ken mention that there were some Alabama folks, Georgia, more likely to get an abstinence-only program. So there is that variation.
And just to add to that, because I work across the country with sex education, and I live in New Orleans, I work in DC, and then just travel all over the place. I find sometimes that folks always make this assumption that those places where they have really great policies, like strong policies in place, like California and the Healthy Youth Act, there's this assumption of like, they're good. They have those policies in place and those young people are getting the sex ed that they deserve. Not always the case. I've been called out to California more than any other state because there's inconsistency in what we are teaching our young people. They're not being compliant in a lot of these places because students who have developmental differences are not receiving sex education. There are situations where in those schools where they do have more funds, there is a little bit more hesitance from administrators to force teachers to do things because they're afraid of the backlash and the power that those parents who carry those, higher purse strings can bring to their district. So it really is dependent upon where you are and who's teaching. And I think that's something that we can continuously strive for. And I'm always looking for the so what now, as Jennifer likes to always say, and it helps me stay grounded because a lot of the times when I'm meeting with teachers or parents about their sex ed, there's no idea about what's being delivered in your own backyard. And it's a lot of like this idea of like the person behind the curtain, well, I think we can do this, and I know we can't do that. And in reality, when we sit down and actually look at what policies are in place, if there are policies in place, there's usually a big disparity as to what we think we can do versus what's actually possible. So if you all are looking for to do from this question itself, I would encourage you to go look up the policy for your school district and see what they're teaching, because you'd be surprised, depending on where you are, that geographic location may not actually indicate whether or not your young people are receiving sex ed at all, or if it's harmful, affirming, complete. So yeah, just to add that there.
Thank you so much, Brittany. So let's talk about consent. I know this panel is about building a culture of informed consent and trying to figure out what that looks like. Oh my gosh, is that a trampoline moment? So I know, when I think about in my own life, I mean, I don't think I learned about consent until I was in college, which was frankly probably way too late. And I think many of us didn't learn about, real consent until later in life. What are ways that we can learn about consent earlier?
I don't think people realize that you're actually learning about consent at a very young age, and we're just not calling it consent, right? Mm-hmm. So when I talk to my niece, when she grabs my pencil or grabs something out of my hand, and I tell her no, or she has to ask first, I am teaching her very foundational levels about consent. And we don't frame it that way in the general public. And so people don't generally know, oh, I actually am teaching a 5-year-old or a young person, my niece is 5, but someone younger about consent. I agree with you, Kim. Most people don't learn about consent until college. I taught at Morehouse in Atlanta for a while, and I remember this young guy, we were talking about consent, and the look on his face, he just got really deflated because he realized that he hadn't been getting consent. And he said, no one ever told me. Like, why didn't people teach you about consent? And you could just see that he was distraught. I will never forget his face on that. So I think when we have to reframe how we talk about consent, like how that we are actually already starting early and often teaching about consent to young people, and then building up to where we get into the more sexual situations later on in life. Brittany, Tanya, you may have something to add to that. Oh, one thing that I want to say, just because someone in the chat mentioned Texas. So Texas is really interesting. Texas, there was this pushback on consent that said that if we taught consent, it just means young people are going to go out and have sex. That is not what consent means. And so it's really just educating people about what consent actually means and what it looks like.
Yeah, I would just add to that totally that I think we are practicing consent our whole lives. Like, we know how to tell a friend no, they can't borrow something or they can't come over, but we don't realize that I often say we know more than we think we know, but out of context, it can be hard to tap those resources in ourselves and that strength and knowledge in ourselves into a different context. But I was just going to add on to the kid, young, you can teach communication to children who don't even have language yet, right? They can say more, like, I want more food or whatever, and they reach for you to hold them. And also an extension of this, just everyday consent, teaching them to ask for things and share and stuff like that, is like body autonomy. So we've all seen young kids be told to hug their grandparents or sit on someone's lap or smile for a picture or whatever it is. And so early on, figuring out how to make sure that the whole family is on board, that we ask for hugs, we ask for love and kisses and whatever. No one has to hug. And that's even contentious between me and my sister with my nephews. She's like, they're just being brats, they need to hug you. And I'm like, no, they don't need to hug me. No one needs to hug me. No one needs to hug anyone that they don't want to. And then when I'm leaving, for a month at a time, I don't see them for a month at a time, I definitely want that hug, but I'm not entitled to it, right? And so teaching even 5-year-olds that they have a say in their own bodies is so, so important.
And can I add to that? Because I totally agree. I do that with my own kids, one of whom just made a cameo. It's not only about teaching them about, seeking the affirming consent, but we've also been practicing what's it like to get a no to something you really want a yes to. And I think because we've been practicing that from such an early age, we can start to work on that whole pressuring the other person. Well, I really do want a hug, and I really do, I'm leaving, I won't see you for another month. And having those kinds of skills, because that's what it is. It's a skill. Consent is a skill. And because we can practice from a younger age, that by the time it might become a sexual encounter, hopefully at that point, not only are they able to seek and gain affirmative consent, but also be able to manage themselves and still show respect when they get the answer they're not looking for. because so often I find that that's the part where the responsibility is always on the person. Like, you know, oh, you asked for consent, but then we never talk about the fact of like how to manage, you know, being let down or disappointed about an answer.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I feel like these speakers are saying so many brilliant things. I want to give them lots of appreciation. So I want to encourage all of you folks listening. You have, if you hover your mouse towards the bottom right hand of your screen, there's a reactions button with like a little smiley face. If you hear something that's like yes, and you want to like give applause, feel free to put up the claps. If you're like I agree, use the thumbs. It's just another way we can show some love to these speakers. We know if we were all in a room together, we'd probably be clapping and snapping and you know, getting all expressive for them. So let's show them a little love in the ways that we can. Thank you all. So, and actually speaking of digital interaction, so, you know, Rona has us in our houses, we're on Zoom, we're on social media, you know, maybe some of us are looking for some sexual expression and gratification and relationships with folks online. Probably maybe most of us are. So I wonder if you all could give us some really practical tips for what does consent look like in digital kind of online sexual exchanges?
People are definitely horny right now. It is real.
Where's my applause button?
Yes, we are desperate for touch right now, for good reason.
So how do we practice consent in that kind of environment?
So I can jump in and get us started, and my fellow panelists will jump in and help fill in the gaps. So consent when it comes to, this chat box is my favorite, and I hope I can get a transcript of this, but consent when it comes to asking for pictures, videos, is all super normal. And I think that when we offer that complete sex education, we have to have that conversation too in a way that is not stigmatizing or shaming to folks who want to engage in that, because it's okay. I think it's just about being very transparent around what legal stipulations are and like being honest about that, but also doing so in a way that's not shaming for folks who want to and are, you know, actively providing consent. So I think with digital consent, it doesn't look too different from things in person. It's all about consistent, clear communication. And for me, consent is not a one-time thing. Consent, when done in a way that makes me feel safe, is something that is continuous. So as things shift, as things change, or as time just kind of goes along, I'm continuously coming back. Are you okay? Is this okay for you? I'm changing, or I'm thinking about something different, and then showing that mutual respect for one another. So it's about being as open in the beginning around who's going to see these images, from the very beginning, what the whole process will be for sharing. Are you going to keep them on your phone? Does anyone have access to your phone? Being open to having that conversation. And then as things change, being very communicative with all parties involved, I think is what's important work with digital consent.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Other panelists want to jump in? Jennifer, unmute.
Sorry, I was having a full-on conversation with myself over here. I like what someone put in the chat box about respecting digital space and consent. You know, there are times when people are looking at various ways where you can get really creative. And for me, you know, both either, whether it's in a sexual or a non-sexual situation, like being okay that I don't want to be on camera right now, or being okay that I don't, you know, that I'm not consenting to this. I don't want to be filmed, or I don't want to do these things. And you know, like that is kind of what this process that, you know, triggers for me when I start thinking about consent in a way that's, you know, and doing it in a, when we talk about consent digitally, how do we do it and teach young people in a way that's not punitive? Anytime that there is a policy or a law that comes out around consent, that at least that I have seen, it's always in a shaming or a punitive way. If you do this, you will, this will happen to you. If you do this, this will happen to you online. And we have to move out of this idea that doing anything online is necessarily a bad thing, or like that there's immediate danger. There can be some pleasure and some joy to doing something online that I don't necessarily want to do in person. And so, those are the things that kind of spark in my head. The last thing that I will say, it's interesting when we talk about consent, is that we don't always model consent in various places, right? So, we say, yes, young people need sex education. Well, do they consent to it? Do they actually want to be there? So that's what consent goes both ways, right? And I think, we have to model these same concepts that we are teaching, and full authority for body, like autonomy, means that young people really do get to decide what they're experiencing and when, and we have to be okay with that. Oh, go off. Thanks, Nikki. I'm gonna snap at you. Thank you.
See, we love to show our speakers love. Thank you so much. So actually, I want to stay on this theme of consent. So I think we've all seen, either on social media or honestly, maybe even from people in our lives, this idea that actively practicing consent somehow ruins the moment, or that it's a buzzkill, or that somehow consent is set up as like in opposition to sexiness. Can we talk a little bit about that? Can we talk about how, how do we push back on that myth, and what's the truth of that?
I can chime in, and then I'm so excited to hear what you all have to say too. And just back on the last piece, I think even before COVID, young people in particular are often starting their sexual journeys online and digitally. Well, hopefully they're starting their sexual journeys with themselves. I say that masturbation is like the key to, understanding your own like desire, and just like a very healthy way to know yourself. But anywho, I'm about to be 34. Even I feel like I learned more on Tumblr in high school than I did in any sex ed I had, right? So like, not only are we having sexual experiences, but we're learning a lot online now, and have been for a while. So yeah, anyway, just to add on to that, but this piece about, sorry, catch me up. I distracted myself.
So you were talking about how, folks learn more on Tumblr than they do in their actual sex ed. And
I know, I'm sorry. The current question we're on, I backed us up too far.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this idea that consent ruins the mood or ruins the moment, like, what do you say to that?
That consent is literally the only way to create a great situation for everyone involved. It's like the only way to make everyone have the best time possible, right? There's literally no other way to have a crazy good time together than to like know people's desires and hotspots and traumas and boundaries. And of course, we don't have to open every door and book and story. We can be our full selves and not reveal everything all the time. We can keep things to ourselves, but also still be very clear about our needs and desires. So it's really important. And I just add that, about this whole moment thing, it's like, consent is sexy. It's like a whole kind of silly campaign, but it is very sexy. And you also don't have to wait until you're in a hot, intimate moment to talk about consent and desires and wants and needs and boundaries. It's a great dinner conversation. It's a great phone conversation, and can really lead you in the direction, definitely lead you in the direction to have the best time possible and be the safest and the happiest and manifest the joy that sex and pleasure should, right?
Can I?
Yeah.
I also just need to talk about like who the messenger is of this message, because I can't drink enough of these privileged tears, because we all know who the folks are on Fox News who are like, oh, it just ruins the moment. Poor me. How do I know? If you having to check in on your partner to make sure that they're comfortable ruins sex for you, then I don't want it. Like, I'm good on that because you clearly aren't even invested or interested in my pleasure whatsoever. And this feels very much like you were just focused on yourself. So for me, I find that that message tends to come from one camp and one camp only. And everyone else is on board with that, because for me, nothing makes me feel better than knowing my partner's needs are being met, my partner is comfortable, and we're consistent. We're both working towards the same goal of making sure that each other is comfortable as well as our own needs are. Like, it's just this, you know, symbiotic relationship here. And so I really push back on that a lot. I was doing an interview on NPR and I was told that they were going to be supportive. Every person who called in about the Brett Kavanaugh proceedings at that point was just, I mean, all the tears. How will I know? No, it's not fair. Like, how do I live? I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure you'll be just fine, Chip. Like, it's not a big deal. I need you to get it together and stop thinking about yourself, because it's immature, it's selfish, it's irresponsible, it's lazy. And the fact that you're not willing to think about your partner's needs demonstrates for me that you're not ready as an adult to have a sexual relationship. And I sincerely hope no one engages in any kind of relationship with you. And I think at this point, and maybe it's the Rona, I'm just tired and I'm exhausted and I don't have time for it anymore, but I'm just calling it out from now on, because I'm like, that's your work to handle. I can only do so much. And if you're willfully going to be ignorant about it, then at this point, like, I just, you know, report and delete you from Facebook. Like, that's my life. I'm just report, delete. So sorry, I had to jump in.
Yes, amen.
Brittany, I hope that you saw the many claps that were showing up while you were speaking. So I want to spend a moment here, because I feel like you brought Chip into the room, and therefore you brought race and gender into this room. And so I just want to give us a moment to like make space for, you know, how does sex positivity, consent, sex ed, like, how does that show up around race and gender?
Sure. So there are a couple of things that I think come into play here, right? So there's one, like, who is designed to be able to enjoy and experience like pleasure and sex, right? The way that sex has traditionally been presented, the stereotypical males get all the bowls of condoms and they're talked about and like hit on the shoulder or whatever you hit them about, here, go get them, champ. And then the idea that women are never taught to experience pleasure and can't communicate our wants and desires, right? And then it goes back to like where Brittany is talking about how Chip doesn't want to check in to see whether or not, you know, she's enjoying herself. And don't even bring in when, you know, you're talking to one woman and I have to then communicate my wants and desires to another woman, because neither one of us have been taught that piece, you know, within school settings. And so, and like, how do I consent to my partner and our experiences there? So there's that. And then I think around race, when we start to think about this, I remember I grew up in an all-white school in Birmingham, Alabama. And I remember the white guys were always like, oh, you're black, you're good in bed, right? The stereotypical that all the black women in the school, that we were some sort of sexual vixens, that we were like swinging off every fucking pole that was nearby us. And you're like, what in the world? And so that you've over-sexualized these black women, and I can only speak as a black woman, but you've over-sexualized these black women, and like and even when we talk about sex ed, right, it's to control black bodies, to reduce the teen pregnancy among black and brown babies, because they're the ones that are having all of this sex. Like, we're just left and right having all this sex, and these are the bodies that need to be controlled. So, I mean, I feel like I've gone off on a bit of a tangent when we're talking about that control, but a lot of when we're talking about sexualization around race, it is looking at whose body who is being controlled, and how do you control those bodies, and how can they experience pleasure. And so that's just some things that I think about right now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
This is a big deal for me, because I feel like so often we don't ever talk about race when it when we talk about sex ed. Like, we don't talk about race at all. And I think when schools go back, however that looks in the fall, that's the request I'm getting now. I do a lot of coaching online with teachers, and the most requested one I've gotten in the last few weeks is how to be responsive, culturally responsive, and how to promote diversity. And I'm like, I just don't have the energy to help you not be racist and give you coaching tips on that, when I'm just like, don't be racist. I don't know what else to add to that. But a lot of that then makes me recognize, like, the issue is who's teaching. And so often it's the educators who are perpetuating a lot of the things that you're talking about, Jennifer. And at this point, I'm just like, I need y'all to retire and get out of here, because it's the young people who need to come and take over, because a lot of these misconceptions, willful misconceptions and harmful approaches to working with our Black and Brown young people are causing the most harm. And there's a lot of, I'll never forget being not only just like our Black and Brown young people, but also my trans young people. I got All Lives Mattered in like a national conference presentation once, where they were like, why are we here talking about being affirming of LGBT young people in sex ed, and specifically Black and Brown LGBT young people? And they were like, everyone needs to know this information. And it's a lot of work, and it's exhausting, to be honest. I'm drained with this, of helping sometimes, for the folks who are interested, understand the importance of being intentional about reaching these young people that we have done a really shitty job of meeting their needs. And so race is such a big deal for that, and it's something that I've continued to bring to the conversation. We are adapting our national curricula that is offered for free, the 3 Rs, to include lessons on race. It's great, it's exciting. It scares me too, because I know some of the teachers who teach these lessons, and I'm like, oh shit, what did I just give you? But I think it's just this, for some, they're gonna have to retire, or we have to move them out and replace them with these amazing new teachers who are coming in, who are very passionate about doing this work. And for others, it's about, school districts reflecting the diverse needs of their community, and kind of putting the Teach for America folks on the back burner for a little bit, and having folks from the community who to actually serve that community. I know so many teachers who were fired and replaced with Teach for America folks, because they're very cost efficient. And so I think it's about a cultural shift in how we want to meet the needs of our young people, but it's going to require some sort of buy-in. And I don't know if folks are there yet, to be honest, unfortunately.
Kim, there's something that I wanted to bring into this a little bit, is that, often, so Brittany led with, and we talked about what does sex education look like and what does sex education mean. And we often think that sex education starts in the classroom, and it doesn't. It starts when I walk into the school system, right? Or the school building. And so this idea that you could just go into a classroom that's supposed to then create this safe space, and I'm going to talk about sex ed, and then I leave, and that's where the sex education stops, is naive, and it's frankly lazy. So, right, if I am experiencing trauma, if I'm walking through the classroom, if I have to go through 5 metal detectors, if I have to be pat down before I even get to the classroom, and then you want me to talk about sex education in this so-called safe and supportive environment, we have to actually think about what does safety look like, both when we talk about sex, but also even to get to these conversations, to have to talk about sex. So, and I know we know where these increase of the metal detectors, we know where the increase of the school resources officers are, and so sex education is not just in the classroom; it is beyond the classroom, and it's to get there in this expectation that you're only going to get this so-called safe environment right here in that 45-minute classroom is unacceptable.
Thank you so much. So I'm curious, we've been talking about sex positivity and pleasure and all of this kind of different vision for what sex ed could look like. Is it possible to be sex positive without wanting to have sex? What are ways that people can practice sex positivity while also creating personal boundaries? And how are we also making space for asexual or demisexual folks?
I can chime in here. I mean, I think this goes back to what I said earlier about sex positivity being like a total paradigm shift, and how you don't have to want sex to want other people to feel joy and like want joy and want pleasure, and know that you are invested in a world where people have access to pleasure and their own boundaries and desires. And yeah, so I think there's like, just like we have a responsibility not to center sex ed around heteronormativity, like we have some responsibility, we have a responsibility not to center sex ed around white supremacy. We also have these responsibilities not to center even cis queerness, right? And so the way that looks with Sexy Sex Ed is that we try to pay people who can speak from their own experience to be in education settings, right? And I know that's not always possible, but when it is, the messenger matters, and it's really important. I don't have as much experience in school settings because our sex education situation in Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia is pretty rough, but and that's just not been where the niche we've been able to fill. So we've been able to have very queer and Black educators be able to get paid to lead sex ed in their own communities, right? In their own words, and really like lead the conversations that they wish they had, right? Also just think that, we use popular education methods to make sure that everyone feels like they are an expert in their own experience, because we are, right? And if you're creating the right container in a consented space where people have come wantingly into this space to talk about really important and really scary things together, that they feel safe enough to speak from their own experience, right? So those are some ways, but I'm excited to hear more from Jennifer and Brittany about especially in school work.
So I don't know how much this shows up in school settings. What I would build on probably what you said is that I think that the idea around sex can show up differently for many people in a lot of different ways. For someone who is asexual, their views on sex could be influenced by a lot of factors, right? And so while there could be an asexual person who views sex as simply as something that they don't desire, or some that may see it as something that's very nice. Like there's a spectrum. So this idea that you can only like hate sex or not, I think is problematic, that we are only viewing sex through one lens. And so I think I can't speak for someone who is asexual. I don't identify, I'm not asexual, but what I will say is that I will not pretend to think that just because you are asexual, it means you hate sex. There can be sex positivity and be asexual at the same time. And I don't think that gets talked about. I feel like I fumbled over that, but in my head, it made a lot of sense.
Thank you, Jennifer. And just so folks know, we are very shortly going to be moving into a Q&A and opening up the floor for all of you to ask your questions. So please tee those up. You can either pop them into the chat now if you would like, or you can go off of mute and actually ask them of the speakers. So I'll start with a question that we already had in the chat, but definitely folks, like, this is your time. Like, we have these amazing experts on the call. We definitely want to learn as much as we can from them. So one question we have from the chat, can we talk about the best ways to deal with, and I'm sorry, I have lost track of the name, so maybe raise your hand and let us know. Can we talk about the best ways to deal with non-consensual sharing of digital sexual content, nudes, etc., that are non-punitive? So many teens have to go in front of judges, deal with school punishment for these types of situations. Are there better ways we can deal with this?
Yeah, so Brittany, I'll talk policy and then I will pass it off to you. So the policy hat in me is like coming into play, and that most of the policies are set up around consent is really dealt in a punitive way. And so we have to shift the way that we're thinking about policy around consent to education rather than a punitive nature. And so when we're educating folks who are developing these policies, when we're educating school administrators, when we're educating judges, really helping them to understand that these conversations around consent or this sharing nature, non-consensual sharing of digital content, how we do that in an education space rather than a punitive space. And that part comes with educating. I will say that, it took Me Too for folks to even start having a real conversation about consent. It took Me Too plus, Me Too in addition to have people think about consent outside of the work setting. Like when I talk about consent, people are like, oh, you mean employment? And so like people are still struggling to understand not only consent, but where consent shows up within society. And so there's just a lot more education that needs to be done. And people do these punitive things under the guise of safety, and it's not. It's more of control. And so that's one piece that I'll add. Britt.
Yeah, and I'm happy you brought your policy hat because I don't like to wear that. And I'm gonna put on my public health hat. And it has been proven that scare tactics do not work. And so to come at this from the approach of like what's happening in the classroom when we try to scare our young people into like following things will happen if you, it doesn't do anything. Like that is not a deterrent for them. It's not realistic. Honestly, I think it's like a moment. I've been in those spaces where they bring in someone and show, like if you have those photos on your phone right now, and you see like the color drain from everybody's face because everybody's got the damn photos. Okay, 1 second, bud. Everyone's got those photos on their phone all the time. So I think instead it's about shifting the conversation away from like following things will happen to what are some ways that we can show respect to a partner? What are some ways for us to engage in this safely and maintain that relationship where both people feel like that it's wanted and respected and needed, and it's an important part of being able to connect with folks. I think it's about actually delivering that complete sex education that we talked about from the very beginning. And so often sex education, as we've already said, it comes from it's never like, why do people have sex? Like we have these really negative conversations about why people have sex. Why do people send nudes to one another? Why do people look at porn? And it's not because we like scary things happening to us. It's because we enjoy it. It's fun. It's pleasurable. And it gives us joy, especially when we're dealing with really stressful. Let me slow down because I know I'm talking fast. Sorry. We are dealing with really stressful situations in our lives. So for us to be able to then use sex as a way to build connection with folks, to meet those needs, to let off a little bit of stress, we need to have those conversations and actually offer the complete sex education that we always talk about. And to be honest, like I don't know how many young people are actually receiving that. So I think it just illustrates another opportunity for us to do a better job where we have not always, met the mark that we needed.
Thank you, Brittany. Thanks to everybody for putting questions in the chat. Let's get into these. So I actually want to start with Chelsea's question, since I think it loops back to the question about folks who are ace or demisexual. Chelsea, do you want to read your question?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I identify as demi and I grew up without the vocabulary to describe my feelings, so I just thought I was broken. How do you see sex ed moving towards a place and known vocabulary to keep ace kids from feeling like they're lacking something for not wanting sex in the same way as others they may know?
Thank you for sharing. I think there are a number of things that we can be doing to move in that direction. One, we can start presenting sex education from a cis hetero white lens. And so that's one. That is the big thing. The smaller, like right now thing that we can also do, so there are these national sex ed standards that have been developed by the Future of Sex Education, also known as FOSSE. These national sex ed standards take into account folks who are demi, folks who are asexual, folks who are queer, trans, folks who are nothing is coming to my mind right now. Everything, not everything. We still have some work to do. I wrote them, so I'm judging myself. I digress. Anyways, there's these national sex ed standards that help your school district, oh, thank you, Chelsea, that help your school district align to ensuring that both sexual orientation, gender identity, expression is all included in the sex education. So you can actually go and map out your current sex education. You can look to see what the standards require and see where the gaps are. And you can start demanding that your school fill in these gaps with these identifiers. So the national sex ed standards are broken down by grade level bands. So K through 5, 6 through 8, 9 and 10, and then 11 and 12. And the great part about that is, like, so I didn't come up with the standards for someone who is asexual. We went to folks who are asexual and can speak to their lived experiences to help create these standards so that it is reflective. Now, that I want to make sure that I also put that, like, we did that for people of color. All of these people are not monoliths, so I do want to make sure that I put that in as a caveat. But it should not, the standards should not be developed by me because that wasn't my lived experience. So I do want to just point that out. So the national sex ed standards are available. They've been updated, and that's one concrete way right now that you could be doing that.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm curious for the folks who are on this call, when you look back on the sex ed that you did or didn't receive, what aspects of your own identity or experience felt left out? And if folks just want to pop that into the chat, like, what about, who you are or the kind of sexuality that you experience just was non-existent and not affirmed in the sex ed that you received? Okay, Anna says everything. Sex ed was non-existent. What aspects of our identities? Okay, disability, LGBTQ+. What other aspects of our identities were left out? Sex equals penis in vagina at my school. Yeah. Anything not cis-centered, imposing the gender binary. Literally everything. Queerphobic. Wow, some bunch of nonsense about anal sex. Virginity myths. Y'all, what a mess we all learned in school. We've certainly got lots of work to do. So feel free to keep popping these into the chat. I want to go back to some of our questions. Danielle asked, what are some really good examples of either sex ed or getting consent in media? We've been thinking a lot about the bad examples. What are some things we can point to?
Wait, digital, can you tell me say that question again?
Yep, what are some good examples of sex ed or getting consent in media? So like, has this been represented in a positive way in like movies or TV shows or, any kind of popular culture representation?
That's a really good question.
I don't think I watch enough TV.
I know. Well, I'm thinking about music and trying to think of like sex positive musicians.
See, and like all of the negative ones are coming to my mind, right? So those are the ones that I can immediately, Sex Ed on Netflix. I did really like that show. I thought that was a really great example, and I saw that. So thank you, Isabel and Anna, for actually mentioning those. That is a good example of one. Sex education, I thought, was well done.
I do love that show. There's not a lot. I guess this is very evident of the fact of like what we all see on TV and listen to in our music. Like there's a big opportunity for growth there. Yeah, I do like Big Mouth.
I don't even know who Harry Styles is. I'm sorry.
Old.
I'm sorry. I don't know who that is. A queer icon. Yeah, it would be. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, Big Mouth.
Yeah, Big Mouth is good. I enjoy that.
You have the right to remain fat. That is a really good book that someone just put in another. I was going to say books too.
Janelle Monáe. Yes,
And Lizzo.
I agree. Yes, all. Well, y'all know.
Yeah.
Clearly,
Yeah.
y'all listen to do more stuff than we do.
This isn't our question. But I would also recommend Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown.
I would recommend Sex Positive Families by Melissa Carnegie. She's really great.
Let's keep putting those recommendations in the chat. I feel like y'all are a whole crowdsource of like sex positive.
Yeah, I should have said Amaze.
Wait, Brittany works for Advocates for Youth. She should have
I just
said
wrote
Amaze.
2 Amaze briefs today. I'm like, oh yeah. Check out Amaze, y'all.
We have you. Awesome. All right. So got some other questions here. Oh, and this is a big one, y'all. Strap in. How do we combat predatory men in organizing spaces? And this is from Jackie. And something that I would offer as maybe an addition to it is like, I think part of what I hear Jackie raising is this question of like, how does sex ed or the lack of it impact our organizing spaces? And are there opportunities to address, I mean, of course, you know, we think about the worst case scenario, right? Someone who's being a predator, but there's probably a range of behaviors that might show up in organizing spaces. And I wonder, yeah, how can we connect these very real harms that organizers are experiencing with, you know, maybe opportunities for sex ed?
I don't have all the answers here, but I will say, you know, a lot of things that can go wrong in an organizing space. You can plan for a lot of things, but preventative measures are usually like, you know, preparation is often the thing to focus on. And just like on this call, we set some grounding rules together. That obviously that doesn't stop men, but it is a good way to say, hey, we all agreed on this thing, that these very clear things that you're like totally out of line on. It gives a good baseline to be able to say, nope, we all said we were going to do this and you're not. You know, I think removing people from organizing spaces is a last resort, but I have much less patience for men in general, cis men, unfortunately.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
The one thing that I was going to say, then I'll toss to you. You know, I think we thought that we think that constantly it comes back to thinking that sex education stops at a certain time, like it stops at 12th grade once you exit school. Sex education is this lifelong process. So if I need to come in and educate your organizers on consent and sex education before you start doing the work, like, so when you're doing these trainings, add in a component on sex education if you've got a coalition of organizers that you're, you know, pulling together, sex education needs to be part of that training. So, you know, I don't pretend to be an organizer. I'm not sure I would be great at it, but I feel like that needs to be a component of getting prepared to even organize, is getting some sort of sex education as part of that, of your work, would be my thought. I'm not afraid to call out and kick people out. I will kick you out in a heartbeat.
It's my favorite thing to do. I too am not an organizer, and I think folks are always surprised when they're like, but you work at Advocates for Youth. I don't ever work with young people. All of my work is working with adults who work with young people, and I think sometimes it's about taking a step back and being very honest and open that there are spaces that are inherently problematic, some nonprofits, including my own. Like, it's not perfect. There's always room for improvement and growth. And I think there's a challenge in getting folks to kind of accept that. And sometimes I think folks equate, oh, a nonprofit, an organizing firm or organization equals inherently good, and that's not always the case. So I think it is about just extending that accountability to everyone, including the leadership, and then having them get out of the way. Hopefully we can have them get out of the way when they need to, but have them get out of the way when it's like no longer their time, because sometimes I think there are folks there who have outstayed their welcome, and I'm always looking for those spaces to kind of get up from the table to make space for someone who needs to be at this table far more than I do. And I hope that others, even, you know, further in this field than I am, are also looking for those opportunities. But for me, that's where my mind went with like how to address this.
I do want to bring into the space what Anna has put in the chat, because I think it's really important. What she has said about, you know, I think it's part of a larger RJ conversation around accountability, harm, and restorative justice. And I did just want to put that out there. So I appreciate you putting that in there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions, folks. So definitely, please keep popping those in the chat. Go ahead, Tanya.
I was just going to say that it's great to ask men to handle other men, white people to handle other white people. Like, that's a good just like rule to come back to occasionally. It's just like handle your people sometimes.
53%, y'all get your people.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about young parents. I know that the very little sex education that I got mostly had nothing but shame and stigma to offer young parents, and basically was presented as like sex ed exists because young parents shouldn't. And that always seemed like a whole bunch of bullshit. So can we talk about, you know, how could a complete or a sex positive education actually not only not contribute to, but even push back on the stigma that has been created around young parents, and even make space for parents to see themselves as having access to pleasurable sexual experiences?
That's a really great question. And I think it's something that a lot of adults who are in this field or work with young people in schools in particular struggle with, that is a choice for some young people, and an absolutely perfect choice for them. And I think it goes back to adults, older people, thinking they know best for young people and that they aren't capable of knowing what would be best for them or what's best for their bodies, and having to step back from that kind of frame of thought. Parenting is always portrayed as incredibly difficult, and it is. Like, it does have its challenges, but I feel like there's a really unfair narrative placed around young parents and all of the things that you're never going to achieve and the negative outcomes that are going to happen for your children. And I love to shift that on that paradigm and call people out when it happens, because my parents were teenagers when they had me, and probably a lot of the reason why I went into this field. And it's always like surprising, because it's usually some adult or a teacher who works with kids who's terrifying, who's like, oh, well, you know, your kids are going to be, they're never going to go to college, they're never going to be successful. That's absolute bullshit. And young people can have children and be phenomenal parents. And I think it's about making sure that that complete sex education talks about that is a choice, that you are capable of doing that, and finding those ways to support our young people who choose to parent. It is not oh, well, you've made your choice, figure it out kind of thing, because as a person who waited until I was 26 to have a child and only received respect because I knew so much about my body. I have this background in childbearing, and I have a master's degree in this content. was the only reason I think I got any kind of respect in the hospital from doctors, but it also made me recognize, and I still wasn't listened to about my body. But it then makes me recognize, like, oh, wow, look at what young people are also dealing with, because they're absolutely not being heard. They're absolutely not being respected. They're not being communicated to, and instead are treated as mistakes. And the choices they're making are mistakes, and that they should be disposed of, as opposed as to respected and lifted up and set up for success, just as we would all of our young people deserve. So it's about being intentional and supporting them, just as we support our adults who are parenting, because I know I can't do this by myself. And so I think it's just about treating young people with the same respect that we expect from others towards ourselves.
I also think it's about shifting the frame for why we talk about sex education, right? So sex education isn't around just to prevent what our society has put out there as a negative health indicator, right? And so how do we shift sex education from this public health perspective to one around justice, one around pleasure, and one about me being able to decide what's best for me and my body and my life. And until we can start shifting that conversation for why people have sex, why people, how people function as just human beings, that's the conversation that we need to be having, not about, oh, you don't have sex because you're going to, get an STI, you're going to become a teen mom. And I'm really glad that the field has moved away from started to move away from presenting sex education and teen parents as a cost-saving benefit. That is the shittiest framing ever. And so as we can keep pushing back against that, I think it's going to be really, really critical. I do want to shout out Natasha Viana, who is one of the leaders of No Teen Shame, who has really pushed the field to get us to even where we are, and we still have a ways to go around this. But she really, really did lead the movement and reframing what it means to be a teen mom and a teen parent, and this idea that I still deserve all of the respect afforded to any other parent. So just throwing that out there too.
And can I just say same thing for STIs, because I feel like folks are immediately discarded, and the reality of it is that it's a very normal part of being a sexual being, and just wanted to highlight that as well, because I feel like folks are very dismissive of anyone who's ever had a baby young or also had an STI. So just, yeah.
Actually, Brittany, I'm not sure if you saw Olivia's question, because Olivia was asking actually exactly that. She asked, how do we talk about people living with STIs? My sex ed experience made it feel like having an STI prevents a person from living their life, being in a relationship, and deserving love and pleasure. So I'd love to hear if you or if any of the other speakers want to speak on this. I mean, I will just share, I feel like, it's always telling. You always see where stigma shows up in terms of like the things that people talk about. And like, I've been working in sexual and reproductive health for many years, and people never talk about STIs. And like, if you walk into a room and you want to have that conversation, it's like, it is so deeply stigmatized. Like, I'm happy to admit that I've had an STI. I think many of us on this call have, right? But we don't talk about it. So how can we break up that stigma?
Yeah, I'd just say that this has to be a bigger healthcare conversation, and how so many vulnerable populations have so little access to healthcare. So many people have so little access to healthcare in this country, and that's been revealed in such a big way in the last few months, of course. But to the last point as well, to kind of swing that in, I was like so thankful for you all to talk about this, just to say that the history of sex ed and especially contraceptives and STI work is very violent. It's connected to eugenics. Like, we are connected, as sex ed workers. We have some responsibility to like acknowledge and know and transform from that history of how just like nasty and violent contraceptives have been in this country in particular and elsewhere, and really used to control people and be punishment. And we don't even have to get into the how STIs have been and STDs have been used to experiment on people, and just like the very disgusting, terrifying history of this and all the trauma that brings, right? And it's generational trauma that we're holding from this shit. So yeah, I think STIs, STD stuff is definitely has to be housed in a bigger like healthcare conversation, and how we, mental health is almost anything that inevitably goes wrong with us with our bodies under capitalism is stigmatized, right, and used against us.
Thank you.
I agree, and I think it's also a really relevant point in the conversation to bring up crisis pregnancy centers. And those folks coming into the schools, because I am seeing them all across the country come into the schools to provide information and sexual risk avoidance, which unfortunately a lot of people are getting, formerly known as abstinence only. I will not call it education because it's not, but there has been a lot of narrative of, if you've ever had an STI, you are no longer worthy of enter everything. They attribute a person who has ever had sex before to being like a piece of chewed gum. There has been a lot of work, and I think a lot of trauma that I'm sure many of us on this call today can share for days and days about the narrative that they've heard in schools and the misconceptions that are perpetuated throughout generations around worth being tied to any part of your body. And it's incredibly harmful and shaming and perpetuates a lot of these risks and challenges, because that's going to impact testing, that impacts notification of past partners. It's just a continuous cycle to keep people down. And I feel like it's intentional about the people who are being targeted with that kind of information, not education. And so for me, I think it's about having amazing folks like you all who are shifting this narrative, who are committed and passionate to this work, who acknowledge that this is an issue and helping to reframe what we talk about with a very human and natural part of life, and that infections are inevitable. We're all in the house because of one right now, and at no point is anyone ever shamed in the way that they are if it happens to be transmitted through a sexual act. And I think it's about calling out those people when conversations are had, and I usually do it with family members or people who I know in my community. I live in New Orleans, y'all. So it's about consistently calling those folks out and educating when you have the willpower, the energy, and the desire to do so, and continuously offering those spaces to normalize normalize this. And a shout out, because now I'm being a proper advocate staff member, that is the brief that I just wrote for the newest Amaze video, was to talk about how normal infections are and not a big deal they are. So that should be coming hopefully soon. I just got that to them. But continuing, to reach our young people with that kind of information and just dispelling these myths that it's a big deal. It's not about if you're going to have an STI, it's about when. It's just so normal, and that's okay.
Thank you, Brittany. So we're down to our last 10 minutes, and we do have a couple more questions we want to make sure we get to. So I'm going to exercise a little moderator privilege here. Tanya, I'm going to ask you to take this one. And they're all super easy ones. Not really. How do you approach teaching pleasure for people who come from sexual trauma?
I think centering people's own experiences and making sure that people feel like experts in their own experience, that what they have lived is very valid, very real, and not, being insistent that people don't have to erase their past or forget it or move on from it. In some, like erasure, you don't have to erase your past and things that you've been through in order to live like a healthy and happy and pleasureful life. for sure. Yeah, I think that's the biggest nugget I have.
Thank you. Huge question. And if folks have any resources on this, please pop them in the chat. And then, so we had 2 questions about kind of older family members. So many of us are probably stuck at home, living a multi-generational life with all kinds of toxic cycles being replicated. So the questions are, what tips do you have for teaching older family members sex positive or pleasure-centered sex ed and consent to break toxic cycles? And related, how do we redirect toxic cycles in a way that makes older family members less defensive and more likely to actually listen? Brittany or Jennifer, do one of you have some thoughts on this one?
So yeah, I won't pretend to be the expert on this one, but I will share a resource that is an amazing expert on this, is Melissa Carnegie. I've shouted her out before. Sex Positive Family. She works with older generations. She works with parents. She works with young people. She has some really great resources. You know, we had talked about consent and how to navigate, you know, young parents, aunts, uncles wanting a hug and demanding a hug. She has really great resources on how to combat that and like how to work with your families and understanding sex education and consent. She does some really great series around the holidays, because that's generally when you get together and maybe you may see, well, pre-COVID, see some family members. She has some really great videos. I know she has done an Amaze video. So I don't have some really strong recommendations for you on this one, but Sex Positive Families is a really, really great resource that I would definitely shout out for you to go and check out. Oh yes, Brittany McBride at the Intimacy Firm. She does faith-based sex education. So if you are in the South, and I only shout out the South because they are what is deemed the Bible Belt. So if you're wanting to unbuckle the Bible Belt, Brittany McBride does a really great job on faith-based sex education, and it's called the Intimacy Firm. She also does a lot around pleasure and pleasure-based sex. And the last person I'll probably shout out is Tanya Bass, and she is deemed the sexologist, the Southern sexologist out of North Carolina. Another really great resource. So I'll chat her in the chat box as well.
Thank you so much. So this brings us to our last question, and I'm going to ask all of our speakers to speak to this, but I'm actually going to ask everyone on the call to join me for a little imagination moment. So I'm going to ask folks, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes. We're just going to do a little bit of visioning, a little bit of imagining. So we've been talking about sex ed as it relates to, you know, kind of making our sex lives better and reducing the possibility of harm and trauma, and all that's awesome. And what would our world look like if everybody got complete sex ed? How would our relationships, our organizing spaces, our jobs be different if everybody understood consent and pleasure and affirmed the experiences of queer and trans folks and folks with disabilities? Like, what would change? So like, imagine waking up in that world. Imagine going to work in that world or going to school in that world. Imagine what your relationships might look like. Imagine what our politics might look like. Just take a minute to kind of be in your big, bold vision about what that world could look like. And as we come back together, I hope you got a little glimpse, a little taste of what a world with complete sex ed might look like. And I'm gonna ask our participants to just maybe pop in the chat a couple words that describe what you were imagining. They could be adjectives, they could be just some little snippets, some little thoughts about what you were just imagining. And I'll ask each of our speakers to answer the question. And then I'll turn it over to Danielle, who will bring us towards closing.
Yeah, I will take it.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I have a couple of, I will try to make this really quickly. We would have a world where people knew what consent meant. We would be able to communicate what we want, sexual desires and pleasure without feeling shame or stigma or having this resistance to do it. I could show up in a job setting, whether it's nonprofit or corporate, and be my full identity. I don't have to, I won't be fired for being trans. I could walk the streets as a Black woman and not be fearful about what's going to happen to me, regardless of what neighborhood. We would be fighting over whether or not to bring down that fucking Confederate flag every day. Trump would not be in office. 53% of white women would not have voted and praised whiteness over my safety of how I will choose to parent. I would have access to services regardless of the zip code that I lived in. And I would have people who reflected my lived experience, not only teaching young people in the classroom, but also I could go to a healthcare setting and get the full range of services without shame or stigma. And that damn doctor who told me I did not need an HIV test because I wasn't one of the gays would not be practicing medicine. And so there's a lot of things that will happen if sex ed. I can keep going, but I want to leave some space for Brittany and for Tanya.
I'm not following that up. I want to live in that world too. What I'm going to follow up with is an action step. So something that I've been doing and working with on our advocates team is supporting our young people who are doing a lot of this organizing work and being intentional around asking school districts to defund the police that are offering security in their schools and taking that money and putting it into their sex ed work. There's a lot of money that's going towards policing, especially Black and brown bodies, and causing them more harm. Let's take the money and actually give them something they need. And you can do that too.
Thank you, Brittany. Tanya, tell us about your vision.
Yeah, I'm with Brittany. I don't know how we talk what Jennifer said. I think that was right on. And I'll just add that I think one of the most, that consent is really political. It's personal and highly political. And that it's so true that one of the most powerful things we can do in this world to create a different one is to feel really comfortable hearing no, because not only does it prepare us for our interpersonal things, but it removes a lot of the fear we have in challenging power, right? And all this is about power. So if you need to go to your fiscal court meeting and demand a redistribution of your town's budget, what's the worst that can happen? If it's hearing no, if no is the worst thing that can happen, then we all feel, and we're already comfortable hearing no, then we have a lot less fear about talking about that budget with people who are making decisions about our lives, right? So I just want to lift that up and hope that we all live in the world that Jennifer described one day.
Thank you. And I want to read a little bit of what we saw in the chat so that we can bring your voices into the space as well. I see safety, pleasure, stronger relationships, trans president, consensual, loving, freedom, joyful, affirming, comfortable, no constant fear, without shame, a world with affordable care, freedom, pride, joy, safety, a world without shame or stigma, no police state, free abortions for everyone. So as we have a little bit more to do as we're going to close out, and I'm going to hand it over to Danielle in a moment. But first, I want to thank all of our speakers. If folks want to go off of mute and offer some snaps or some claps or jazz hands or woohoos, show some Brittany, Tanya, and Jennifer sharing their brilliance with us today. Just as you after this call and as you go about your days and weeks, I invite you to try to inhabit that place in your imagination that is the world that you want to build. I know that it's what keeps me in this work day after day, and it's nice to go live in that happy place now and then as an escape sometimes from this world and as a reminder to where we want to go. I really, so much appreciation for all the speakers, so much appreciation for all of the participants. Y'all have been in this for a couple of hours and you've been bringing all of your own brilliance into this conversation. So show a little love and appreciation to yourselves. All the resources, all the great music and book tips, and all the great questions. So thank you all, and I will turn it over to Danielle, who will take us through our last bit of our time together.
Yeah, thank you. You did half of okay. You did half of my job for me, which is thanking, of course, all of our panelists, thanking all of y'all for coming. Many of you for the second day. Hopefully, you'll be here for all four, plus the party. Just thanking y'all for hanging tough and continuing to like really deeply engage with each other and with the panelists. I so appreciate all of the energy that it takes. And of course, again, want to thank the Rio Grande Valley Language Justice Collective, there we go, for, again, continuing to hang out with us and provide interpretation services. They will also be with us for the rest of our sessions. And also, I will continue to let you all know, give y'all updates about whether or not the transcription will be available. Likely it'll be an update throughout the sessions, but we will do our best to get that for folks either in the midst of the sessions or afterward when we put all of these up for recording later. That's all I have. Just like I said yesterday, we will be here Friday, we will be here Saturday, all at the same time. And I hope y'all have a good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.